Theodore Robert Ted Bundy was a prolific American serial killer, serial rapist, and kidnapper, active in several states in the 1970s. He is considered one of the most notorious serial killers in U.S. history. Born on November 24, 1946, Ted Bundy was an American serial killer who raped, kidnapped, and murdered approximately 30 girls and women throughout the mid-1970s. Widely described as polite and charismatic, he evaded the police for years. However, after numerous escapes from justice, he was finally arrested for the final time in 1978. After a trial that ended in a conviction and 3 death sentences, Ted Bundy was executed at the Florida State Prison on January 24, 1989. On January 4, 1974, Bundy, who then attended law school at the University of Puget Sound, mercilessly attacked University of Washington student Karen Sparks at her home in Seattle. He carried a sharp knife, so he cut up the bodies after raping and cutting off the girls' sexual organs, then brutally cut the bodies. Sparks became one of Bundy's few victims who survived, even though she suffered permanent brain damage from the attack. Linda and Healy is another college student who disappears from her off-campus home in the early morning hours, leaving behind a carefully made bed stained with blood. Her remains were found a year later, along with those of other women, outside Seattle on Mount Taylor. 2 college students, Janice Ott and Dennis Mockend, disappear from Lake Sammamish State Park in the Seattle area within a 3-hour time frame. Eyewitnesses recall a young man named Ted asking women to help carry his boat. His description matches that of the injured Ted, who was seen in nearby schools from which several female students went missing. Many of these young women share a notable physical characteristic: long, center-parted hair. After leaving his job at the Department of Emergency Services in Olympia, Washington, Bundy heads to Salt Lake City to resume his studies at the University of Utah School of Law. Posing as a police officer in Murray, Utah, Bundy lures 18-year-old Carol DeRanche from a mall into his tan Volkswagen Beetle, where he attempts to place handcuffs before she drives away. Later that day, 17-year-old Deborah Kent disappeared after leaving a high school play to pick up her younger brother. Investigators find a key in the school parking lot that fits the handcuffs used on DeRanche. Bundy killer in Colorado. A 23-year-old nurse named Karen Campbell disappears from her hotel in Snowmass, Colorado. Her body is found a few weeks later in a snowbank outside the resort village. Bundy killed 2 students and wounded 3 others at Florida State University. Bundy broke into FSU's Chi Omega sorority house at about 3 a.m., strangled Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, and beat Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler with a baton-like object before fleeing. He then entered another house a few blocks away and brutally assaulted another student, Cheryl Thomas. Kleiner, Chandler, and Thomas survived their injuries, although none of them could describe the attacker. Bundy is briefly arrested. Highway Patrol Sergeant Bob Hayward stops a Volkswagen Beetle that had been left outside a home in Granger, Utah. Bundy and Hayward arrest the driver after finding a ski mask, a crowbar, an ice pick, and handcuffs in the car. But the charges of evading the police are not enough to keep him detained for long, and Bundy is soon released. Although previous efforts to identify Bundy had failed, Dara Winch and 2 other women pointed him to the police lineup. He was arrested and charged with attempted kidnapping. After a 5-day trial, during which he waived his right to be heard by a jury, Bundy was found guilty of aggravated kidnapping and sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison. Bundy is charged with first-degree murder. Investigators linked Bundy to Campbell's death in January 1975 by the discovery of her hair in his car, the use of his gasoline credit card in the vicinity on the day of her disappearance, and eyewitness accounts of his presence at her hotel. He was extradited to Aspen, Colorado, in early 1977 to stand trial. Bundy escaped from prison. He was transferred to a more secure facility in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, losing enough weight to escape through a hole in his ceiling and into the duct system. He goes out to an empty apartment of a prison worker, changes his clothes and escapes, this time leaving Colorado behind and eventually ending up in northern Florida. Bundy is finally arrested. After stopping a car with its headlights on at 1:30 a.m., and finding the plates to match those of a stolen car, Pensacola police officer David Lee found himself in a violent altercation with a driver unwilling to immediately reveal his identity. The man eventually revealed himself as Bundy, wanted by the FBI. Ted Bundy trial for Florida attack. The trial, reported to be the first to be nationally broadcast, begins with jury selection at the Dade County Metro Justice Building in Miami. Bundy complains to Judge Edward Cowart about the conditions of his prison cell, setting the stage for a month of proceedings, as he fights with his attorney, takes over the questioning of a police officer and sits to testify while referring to himself in the third person. Despite defense objections to his testimony, forensic dentist Richard Swaron compares large photographs of Bundy's teeth to those of bite marks found on an FSU student and declares them identical. Ted Bundy marriage. During the penalty phase of the trial, Bundy proposed to his girlfriend, Carol Boone, in the presence of a notary, making their marriage legal. Shortly thereafter, jurors recommended the death penalty for the newly married convict. Confession of Ted Bundy. After confessing to several murders, including 3 that occurred before the 1974 Northwest Wave, Bundy sits down for an interview with evangelist James Dobson and blames his crazy behavior on his addiction to alcohol and pornography. That evening, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected an emergency stay of the prisoner's execution by a vote of 5-4. Ted Bundy executed by electrocution. On January 24, 1989 at Florida State Prison, Bundy was restrained in an electric chair called Old Sparky at approximately 7 a.m. The notorious killer was pronounced dead by electrocution at 7:16, to cheers from about 200 people gathered outside.